I want to start this story with a question that has been bothering me for a long time. Not a legal question, not even really a criminal question, a human one. What actually happens inside a person's mind at the moment a crime is committed? What happens in the seconds before someone crosses a line that cannot be uncrossed? Is it rage, desperation, fear, relief? Or is it something stranger, something half-conscious, something that even the person themselves might not fully understand? That question is the reason I started looking into this case. But the strange thing is, the deeper I went into it, the less clear the answer became. Because this story, the death of Amy Fanyan, doesn't resolve that question. If anything, it makes it more complicated. And even now, after watching the interviews, reading the testimony, and looking at the evidence presented in court, I'm left with the same uneasy feeling. I can't say with absolute certainty what really happened inside that house. What I can do is walk you through the story, step by step, and explain why this case continues to divide people even after the verdict.
Hi, this is Brian Fanyan. I'm at North Road. My wife just shot herself.
The story begins on May 8th, 2018. It was a quiet afternoon in the small town of Westfield, Massachusetts. A typical New England town where people know their neighbors, where church and community events matter, and where reputations can follow families for generations. Inside a farmhouse on North Road, 51-year-old Amy Fanyan was preparing lunch. Her husband, Brian Fanyan, had just arrived home from work. Brian wasn't just any husband. He was a detective with the Westfield Police Department. In the community, he was known as a respected officer, a church deacon, a volunteer on missionary trips. For many people in town, the Fanyans seemed like the ideal couple. They had been together since they were teenagers. Amy was 16 when she met Brian, who was 19 at the time. They married in 1985. More than 30 years of marriage followed. They raised 2 children. They were active in church. They traveled on mission trips. They volunteered in their community. To outsiders, their life looked stable, faithful, and deeply rooted. But behind that appearance, like in many long marriages, there were tensions. And on that afternoon in May, something happened that would completely destroy the image of that family. At around 1 p.m., Brian Fanyan called 911. His voice sounded panicked. He told the dispatcher something shocking. His wife had just shot herself. Emergency responders and police rushed to the house. When investigators entered the dining room, they found Amy lying on the floor. She had been shot once in the head. There was blood on the floor beneath her body. Nearby, investigators found a .45 caliber Smith & Wesson pistol, Brian's own service weapon. The room looked strangely ordinary for such a violent moment. On the dining table sat a peanut butter and jelly sandwich on a plate. Another plate nearby had a smear of blood. Chairs were slightly pushed out. Papers and a police radio were nearby. It looked like a normal lunch scene interrupted by tragedy. According to Brian, that's exactly what had happened. He told investigators he had come home for lunch. Amy was making sandwiches. But when he arrived, an argument resumed, one that had started the night before. The argument, Brian said, was about retirement. After decades on the police force, he was planning to retire soon. Amy wanted to stay in their historic 200-year-old house. Brian wanted something different. He wanted to travel more. He didn't want to spend his retirement maintaining an old property. They argued about their future. They argued about responsibilities. They even argued about their aging dog and whether they should get another one. Normal marital disagreements. Nothing that seemed remotely connected to what would happen next. Brian said that at some point during the argument, he placed his gun on a cabinet in the dining room before stepping into the bathroom. When he came out, Amy was holding the gun. According to Brian, she raised the gun to the side of her head. He remembered her saying something like, "I guess you don't want me around." Brian said he was only a few feet away. He tried to reach her, but before he could stop her, the gun fired. Amy collapsed. Brian said he rushed to her side, held her hand, and then called 911. If that version of events were true, the case would have been tragic but simple. A sudden emotional breakdown, a terrible impulsive decision. But almost immediately, detectives began noticing details that didn't fit that explanation. One investigator later said something important. The moment he saw the wound, he had a feeling something wasn't right. And eventually, the forensic report supported that instinct. Normally, when someone shoots themselves at close range, certain forensic markers appear. Gunshot residue, microscopic particles from the gunpowder, usually land around the wound. There is also a pattern called stippling caused by those particles striking the skin. But in Amy's case, those markers were missing. Ballistic analysis suggested the shot may have been fired from a distance of about 18 inches or more. And that detail changed everything. Because if the gun was not directly against her head, the possibility of suicide suddenly became much less certain. At the same time, investigators uncovered another part of Brian's life that raised serious questions. Brian had been communicating with another woman. Her name was Corey. They had met months earlier during a church mission trip to Mexico. What started as friendship gradually became something more emotional. Investigators later recovered hundreds of deleted text messages between them. Some of those messages sounded unmistakably romantic. On the night before Amy died, Brian texted Corey, "Good night, my love. I hope you have wonderful dreams of the amazing days and nights ahead." She responded, "I will dream of you and all the future holds for us." The next morning, just hours before Amy's death, the two exchanged more messages. Corey asked when she could hold him again. Brian replied, "Not soon enough." Within hours of that message, Amy was dead. And naturally, investigators began asking a difficult question. Was this still a suicide, or something else entirely? Because affairs are one of the most common motives investigators see in domestic homicide cases. A person wants a new life, a new partner, and sometimes a spouse becomes the obstacle. But motive alone is not proof. Many people have affairs. Very few murder their spouses. Still, detectives kept digging, and what they found next made the situation even more disturbing. Search history. Forensic analysts examining Brian's computers found internet searches about poisons, carbon monoxide deaths, and gunshot residue. One search involved watching a video explaining how gunshot residue tests work. Another involved looking at lists of deadly substances. To prosecutors, those searches looked like preparation. To the defense, they were meaningless curiosity. And this is exactly where the case begins to split into two completely different interpretations. One interpretation paints a picture of planning. A man unhappy in his marriage, a new romantic partner, internet searches about death and forensic evidence, a convenient moment alone in the house. But the other interpretation sees something very different. A long marriage under stress, an argument, an impulsive emotional reaction, and a tragic accident or suicide that investigators later misunderstood. The deeper you look at this case, the more it begins to feel like two stories happening at the same time. And depending on which evidence you focus on, either story can start to look believable. That's what makes this case so unsettling, because even the people closest to Amy were divided about what really happened. Many members of Amy's own family believed Brian was innocent. They signed a letter stating they believed Amy had taken her own life. Think about that for a moment. It is extremely rare for the victim's family to defend the accused. But Brian had been part of that family for over 30 years. He wasn't an outsider. He was a son-in-law, a father, someone who had shared decades of life with them. And psychologically, accepting that a loved one committed suicide can sometimes feel less unbearable than believing someone you trusted committed murder. But not everyone agreed. Amy's sister Anna testified in court for the prosecution. She told the jury that Brian once admitted searching online for information about how to make a murder look like a suicide. Whether that search actually existed in the computer records became another point of debate during the trial. And by the time the case finally reached a courtroom years later, the central question remained the same. Did Amy Fanion take her own life, or did the man she had spent 30 years with pull the trigger? By the time the case finally reached trial, nearly 5 years had passed since Amy Fanion's death. And during those years, the investigation had slowly built a picture, one that prosecutors believed pointed clearly toward murder. But even then, the case remained far from simple, because every piece of evidence seemed to come with a counter-argument. And that is exactly what made this trial so unusual. The prosecution's theory was straightforward. They believed Brian Fanion had reached a turning point in his life. After decades of marriage, he had fallen in love with someone else. Corey represented a new beginning. But Amy, his wife of more than 30 years, was still there. And according to prosecutors, divorce was not something Brian wanted, not because it was impossible, but because of what it would mean. Brian was not just a husband, he was a police detective, a church deacon, a respected figure in a small, tightly connected community. Divorce would have been public, messy, embarrassing, and the prosecution argued that Brian feared the damage it would cause to his reputation. So instead they said he chose another way out. Their theory was that during the argument that afternoon, Brian shot Amy and then tried to make the scene look like a suicide. To them, the evidence lined up. The affair, the internet searches, the inconsistencies in his statements, and the forensic evidence suggesting the gun had been fired from a distance. But the defense saw the same facts very differently. Brian's attorneys argued that the prosecution was trying to turn ordinary details into sinister ones. Yes, Brian had been having an emotional relationship with Corey, but emotional affairs, they argued, happen in thousands of struggling marriages. That does not make someone a murderer. And those internet searches? The defense suggested they could easily have innocent explanations. Some of the searches involved household dangers, poisons, and carbon monoxide. Brian lived in an old farmhouse with a wood-burning stove. At the time, a young relative was staying in the home. The defense suggested he may simply have been researching safety risks. And the search about gunshot residue? Brian was a police detective. Understanding forensic evidence could easily fall within professional curiosity. But the defense's most important challenge focused on the forensic evidence itself, because the prosecution's case relied heavily on one idea, that the absence of gunshot residue around Amy's wound meant the gun had been fired from a distance. But the defense presented an expert who offered a completely different explanation. He argued that Amy's thick hair could have blocked the gunshot residue from reaching the skin. Hair, he explained, can act like a filter. Particles that would normally land on the skin can instead become trapped in the hair. To demonstrate this theory, the expert conducted experiments firing a gun through hair placed over ballistic material. The results showed a striking difference. With hair in the way, far fewer particles reached the surface beneath. Without hair, the residue pattern was obvious. In other words, the absence of residue on Amy's skin did not necessarily prove the gun had been fired from far away. And suddenly, the prosecution's strongest forensic argument looked less certain. But there were still the internet searches. Those searches were difficult for the defense to explain, because even if they had innocent explanations individually, taken together they painted an uncomfortable picture. Searches about poisons, searches about deadly substances, a video explaining gunshot residue testing. And all of those searches appeared after Brian had begun communicating with Corey. To many observers, the timing felt suspicious, but suspicion is not the same as proof. And this is exactly where my own thoughts about this case became conflicted, because when I look at Brian Fanion, I cannot say he feels completely innocent. Watching his interviews, I get a strong impression of someone who is extremely controlled, very careful with his words, very aware of how he presents himself. Of course, that may not be surprising. He was a police detective, someone trained to remain calm during stressful situations, someone used to interrogations and investigations. But there is another detail that still bothers me. Brian initially told investigators that his relationship with Corey was only a friendship. Later, the text messages showed something much more intimate. That means he had already lied once. And when someone lies about one important thing in an investigation, it becomes harder to trust the rest of their story. At the same time, I also cannot ignore something else about this case. Amy's own family largely supported Brian, her mother, her siblings, even her children. Most of them believed Amy may have taken her own life. And that is an incredibly unusual situation. Usually, in murder trials, the victim's family demands justice. Here, many of them defended the accused. But when you think about it, there may be understandable reasons. Brian had been part of their family for more than 3 decades. He had raised children with Amy. He had shared holidays, milestones, and memories with them. Accepting that someone so deeply integrated into the family could suddenly commit murder might have been emotionally unbearable. And sometimes people choose the explanation that hurts the least. Another question that often comes up in this case is about the scene itself. Why did it happen during such an ordinary moment? Lunch? Sandwiches on the table? A conversation about retirement? But the more I think about it, the less that detail seems to prove anything. Because depending on how you look at the story, that moment can be interpreted in completely different ways. If Amy shot herself, the scene makes sense, arguments escalate, emotions rise, impulsive actions happen in everyday moments. But if Brian shot her, the scene can also make sense. An argument gets out of control, a moment of anger, or even a deliberate attempt to stage something that would look like a spontaneous suicide. So the sandwiches on the table, the quiet domestic setting, do not really answer the central question. They only make the situation feel more tragic. After weeks of testimony, the trial finally reached its final stage. Closing arguments were delivered. The prosecution repeated their theory. Brian Fanion had deliberately murdered his wife to start a new life. The defense repeated theirs. Amy acted impulsively and tragically took her own life. Then, the jury left the courtroom to deliberate. 2 days later, they returned with a verdict. Guilty. Brian Fanion was convicted of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Some people in the courtroom cried, but not everyone was reacting the same way. Some were grieving Amy. Others were grieving the man they believed had just been wrongly convicted. And that is where this story leaves me. Because even after everything we know, this case still lives in a grey area. There are things that make Brian look suspicious. The affair, the internet searches, the lie about the nature of his relationship. But there are also things that leave room for doubt. The conflicting forensic interpretations, the support from Amy's own family, and the fact that there was no eyewitness, no confession, and no definitive piece of evidence proving exactly what happened in that room. If someone asked me today whether Brian Fanion could have committed this crime, my honest answer would be yes. I believe he was capable of it, but if someone asked me whether the evidence removes all doubt, I'm not sure I could say that either. And that is why this case continues to stay with people long after the verdict. Because sometimes the truth is not clear. Sometimes it hides somewhere between suspicion and certainty. And sometimes, even after a jury has spoken, the question that started everything still remains. What really happened in that room?